I knew something was off when the intern called me Mrs. Firewall. Not ma'am, not Jess, Mrs. Firewall. I've spent 10 years writing the protocols that keep this company from getting sued into a crater, and now I'm apparently a meme in the break room. My name's Jessica Morgan, head of compliance for a mid-sized tech firm that thinks compliance is what you do after the damage is already done. They treat me like the office fire extinguisher, unseen, unloved, but expected to perform miracles the second something starts smoking. Last quarter, our CTO introduced a new vendor without so much as an email to my team. A month later, that vendor had a minor breach. Minor meaning 27,000 client records were almost exposed because the password was literally password. I caught it in the logs, quietly filed the report, cleaned it up, again. No parade, no bonus, not even a lukewarm thanks. Oh, I did what any tired, undervalued woman with a closet full of blazers and a slowly dying love for spreadsheets would do. I scheduled a one-on-one with the CEO. I didn't walk in with fireworks. I had a folder, color-coded tabs, bullet points, year-over-year compliance rates, 3 successful SOC2 audits, and the clause I'd authored in our MSA that made us legally bulletproof in case of a breach. 5 years of spotless records. I sat down across from the man who used to call me his firewall queen in board meetings and said calmly, I'd like to talk about a raise. 5%, that's all I asked. Not even enough to cover the extra work I'd taken on after Donna left last spring. But fair, earned, he didn't say no. He said, let's talk after Q2. That was CEO speak for I'd rather die than pay you what you're worth. Now, before I go on, real quick, if you're listening to this and thinking, damn, then yeah, you get it. If 90% of you are listening without subscribing, hey, that's fine, but hitting that button really helps the team keep stories like this coming. And a like, that's basically a high five from your soul. Anyway, Q2 came and went. Then the CEO retired and his son slithered in. MBA, shiny shoes, firm handshake. Told everyone we'd be flattening org structures and removing redundancy. You ever been called redundant by a guy who thinks SOC2 is a new gaming console? His name was Chase. Of course it was. Chase brought in a consultant named Brent, yes, really, to modernize compliance. Brent once told me that having 3 backups for sensitive data was paranoid. I told him my dentist wears gloves because people are gross, not because he expects plague. Brent didn't laugh. Brent doesn't get jokes. Chase called me into his office one day and leaned back in his ergonomic throne like a discount Bond villain. Jessica, he said, you're not ready for a 5% raise. That's when I smiled. Not the nice kind either. The kind of smile you give when someone tells you your house is ugly and you already signed the paperwork to buy theirs. I just stood up, straightened my spine, and said, thanks for the clarity. And that's when I started clocking out exactly at 5 p.m. No more late-night cleanups. No more pre-audit simulations. No more plugging gaps left by Chase's clown car of consultants. I watched quietly while they migrated our client documentation to a shiny new AI-driven platform that couldn't distinguish between HIPAA and hiccups. But I wasn't angry. Not really. Because while Chase was busy playing dress-up in Dad's chair, I was busy reviewing every MSA we'd signed in the last 3 years, making a few updates. Silent ones no one would notice unless they looked. And Chase, he never looked. I embedded a clause, nothing aggressive, nothing flashy. Just one sentence tucked into a paragraph about audit trails and security sign-offs. Legal approved it without blinking. Client signed without question. It read, final sign-off for any and all security audits to be completed and validated solely by Head of Compliance, Jessica Morgan, or her appointed successor. I didn't tell anyone, not even my team, because I knew what was coming. They always come for the firewall last. The email subject line said it all, leadership transition announcement. I already knew what it meant. The old man was finally stepping down, and the golden sperm himself, Chase, was taking the throne. Word around the office was he'd been shadowing operations for months, which must have been corporate code for sipping cold brew in meetings he didn't understand and nodding a lot. Chase strutted into his first all-hands in a blazer that cost more than my monthly mortgage and a smile so smug it could curdle oat milk. We're flattening our hierarchy, he declared, as if cutting middle management wasn't just corporate cosplay for saving money. He threw around words like disruption and scalability like confetti at a frat wedding, but it was clear he didn't understand the anatomy of a single system we relied on. The CTO's face said it all, somewhere between constipation and full-blown dread. Chase's second day, he called me into a one-on-one. His assistant scheduled it for 3:05 p.m. sharp. I remember because I still had the tab open from reviewing a vendor contract that literally had a blank space where a liability clause should have been. His office smelled like new leather and desperation. He gestured for me to sit, leaning back like he'd been rehearsing for a Forbes photo shoot. Then came that line, that precious little grenade he lobbed with all the subtlety of a toddler with a chainsaw. You're not ready for a 5% raise, just like that. No preamble, no context. No, hey, thanks for carrying this company's compliance on your back while we slept through breach after breach. Don't even remember blinking. I just smiled. The smile of someone who's already packed her umbrella before the storm hits. Thanks for the clarity, I said, because it's the kind of phrase that doesn't give your enemy anything to chew on. Then I stood up, adjusted my blazer, and walked out of his glass-walled fishbowl like it was a crime scene I had no intention of revisiting. That was the last time I worked past 5 p.m. No more quick favors. No more last-minute policy rewrites to cover someone's screw-up. If a developer wanted an exemption request rushed, they could ask Chase. If legal couldn't find version 6 of the SOC2 documentation, tough. It was in the shared drive, under the folder labeled Do Not Ignore. They always ignored it. The shift was immediate. I stopped answering pings after 5:01, stopped explaining terms they should have understood from onboarding. I stopped being everyone's backup plan, and something strange happened. People got nervous, not loudly, not dramatically, but I could see it in the emails that suddenly started CCing me again, the meeting invites that popped back onto my calendar, the junior analyst who asked awkwardly if I was still leading compliance. I was, just not for them anymore. I had already started phase 1, the quiet lockdown. I reviewed every single MSA revision for the last year, ensured the clause I'd inserted. Final sign-off by Head of Compliance Jessica Morgan was present in all active agreements. Double-checked timestamps, confirmed digital acceptance logs, downloaded PDFs, stored hard copies, multiple locations, one on an encrypted flash drive buried in a drawer that hadn't been opened since I moved offices 3 years ago. I updated our internal playbooks, not the ones in the company wiki, the real ones, the ones I kept in my private drive. Step-by-step instructions for external audits. Contact lists for every vendor rep we worked with. Version control logs with metadata stamps that Chase wouldn't even know how to read. And every evening at 4:59, I'd shut my laptop, grab my bag, and walk out past Chase's office, where he usually sat, feet on desk, watching YouTube videos about visionary founders. I could have warned him. I could have said, hey Chase, maybe check clause 14.3 before you light your future on fire. But I didn't because Chase didn't want a compliance officer. He wanted a scapegoat, and I've never played that role well. It started with the email threads, small, subtle exclusions like paper cuts. One day I noticed I wasn't CC'd on the endpoint encryption renewal chain. Then it was the quarterly vendor risk review, which I'd led for 6 years. Gone. No invite. I figured maybe it was a mistake. People forget, Outlook glitches, that sort of thing. But then came the reorg deck. Chase rolled it out in an all-hands with all the grace of a frat pledge auctioning off someone else's legacy. Slide after slide of buzzwords, agility, efficiency, cloud-native synergy. But the key slide, a new compliance and risk modernization initiative spearheaded by, wait for it, a third-party consultant named Kale. Yes, with a K. And yes, he pronounced it like kale, as in the vegetable everyone pretends to like. Kale wore those trendy, matte black glasses that scream I have opinions about your onboarding process, and kept calling everything legacy. He was Chase's shiny new toy, a man who once worked at a company that might have been featured in a podcast no one listened to. And now he was here to modernize compliance workflows, which apparently meant renaming folders and turning our bulletproof internal audit protocol into a Slack-integrated Trello board with zero access controls. Kale's first move was to create a new dashboard with live compliance metrics, which is hilarious because compliance isn't live, it's archival. It's paperwork. It's the slow, grinding protection that makes sure nobody ends up in handcuffs or the Wall Street Journal. Kale was too busy trying to gamify risk management to ask how anything actually worked. Chase sent a follow-up email about how Kale would be leading the compliance function for now. No mention of me. Just like that, the woman who built the function was ghosted from her own blueprint. Even my title disappeared from the org chart in the next update, replaced with consultant liaison. So I did what they never expect someone like me to do. I let Kale rename things. I let Chase announce new workflows. I let them throw around acronyms like confetti, NIST, ISO, PCI as if they were cocktail ingredients. I didn't correct them when they confused endpoint security with end-user training. I didn't stop them from pushing out policies without vetting. I just watched, took notes, logged everything. And while they were busy building their glittery house of cards, I went into the MSA archive. See, one of the perks of being invisible is no one notices what you touch. I opened the master template we used for all new client engagements, our boilerplate, the one legal rubber stamped without reading if the change log was under 10 lines. And I added one sentence. Just one, buried beneath our security obligations, right above the line where breach disclosures are covered. Final sign-off for security compliance and audit certification must be performed and approved solely by the head of compliance, Jessica Morgan, or an expressly designated successor in writing. I didn't bold it, didn't highlight it. No one reads the seventh bullet under Appendix C, especially if the formatting looks identical to every other clause. I updated the revision log with the same dry language I always used, security clarification added per internal best practices. Then I uploaded the new template, and I watched the contracts go out to 2 major clients that week, to 5 the next. Then 7. Legal never blinked. Sales didn't care, they were too busy chasing Q3 quotas. No one noticed that a single sentence had given me the legal equivalent of a dead man's switch. And just in case, I backed up the signed versions. Stored them on my encrypted drive, timestamped and archived, multiple formats, PDF, XML, plain text. Hell, I printed one out and mailed it to my sister's house just to be safe. She's a librarian, she respects records. Kale, meanwhile, held meetings without agendas, made diagrams in Figma that looked like subway maps to nowhere. Chase loved it, said Kale was a visionary. I sat through one of their new team syncs where they debated whether compliance reports should be aesthetic. I wish I was kidding, so I kept smiling. Because while they were busy painting the Titanic lavender and calling it innovation, I had quietly rewritten the terms of the iceberg. The calm before the storm isn't silence. It's a woman who knows exactly how this ends and is already holding the match. It started, as most corporate failures do, with a patch that didn't get applied. Kale, Mr. Disruption through Design, had removed our quarterly patch audit checklist because it felt punitive. Said it killed innovation. Chase backed him up, of course, called it legacy gatekeeping. So when a routine vendor update broke endpoint encryption across 3 departments, it wasn't flagged until a junior engineer noticed files syncing to a dev mirror that should have been decommissioned in 2019. That mirror had client metadata in it. Nothing explosive, but enough to require a disclosure. Enough to trigger the clause buried in every MSA. Kale held a Zoom call, said it was a minor hiccup in the ecosystem. Chase, he laughed, literally laughed, called it the cost of velocity, and me, I just took notes. I documented every timestamp, every deleted Slack message, every version rollback in our internal system. I didn't warn them, I didn't fix it. I'd spent years being their net and they'd cut the cords, so I let gravity do its thing. The CTO, Dan, started showing up by my desk again. Not formally, not with a calendar invite. He'd swing by with a "hey, got a weird one for you," and linger like he was just passing through. One day it was about audit logs for our MFA system. Another, it was whether we still maintained the offboarding policy we used to keep in box. Questions I knew he knew the answers to. I finally said, "Want me to pull the real reports?" He didn't say yes. He just exhaled through his nose and nodded, so I did, but only for him. No paper trail, no shared folders. Just a USB drive passed between coffee mugs and pleasantries, off the record. Back-channel compliance in a company that thought security was a shared Google sheet with a password like Winter 2022. The next ripple came from sales. They landed a new healthcare client, big account, big expectations. That client had a vendor checklist longer than a CVS receipt. Penetration testing records, third-party risk assessments, SOC2 controls, retention policies, audit logs going back 2 years. Kale tried to dazzle them with a branded PDF that had a pie chart and a photo of a smiling intern. The client's reply was short. "Where is the original documentation? The sign-off files? Where is the actual head of compliance?" The file they were asking for didn't exist in Kale's world, but it did in mine. And suddenly I was being pinged again. Soft pings, cautious. Not from Chase, not yet, from the client success manager. From a senior AE who used to roll his eyes when I asked if he'd read a redlined clause. They all came with the same phrase: "Hey, sorry to bug, do you happen to have..." Yes. Yes, I did. I sent the documents, not because I was trying to be helpful, because those files weren't just mine, they were proof of what we were before Chase started playing CEO dress up, and every request was another domino lining up. Word spread quietly. Jessica has it, Jessica knows where it is. Jessica still keeps the real logs. Then came the vendor breach. Not ours, a vendor of a vendor. A subcontractor buried under a contract stack. Their internal database got scraped by a botnet. No passwords leaked, but IP addresses did, enough to raise eyebrows. Kale called it a non-event. The client didn't. They called legal, asked if the incident had been flagged, documented, and if Jessica had reviewed it. I hadn't because no one told me. Legal pinged me, the GC herself. "Hey Jessica, any chance you saw this before?" I replied with one sentence. I was removed from all vendor monitoring channels 2 months ago per Chase's directive. That was it. No blame. No drama. Just fact and silence followed. That kind of silence that sounds like an engine dying mid-flight. I knew what was happening. The thread was unraveling. One missed patch, one oversight, one clause in an MSA. That's all it ever takes, but I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. Not yet, because I knew what was coming. The clause I'd written was waiting like a loaded chamber in a locked room, and someone somewhere was about to open the door. Chase called it the Compliance Excellence Summit, as if the words themselves hadn't just crawled out of a satire sketch. The invite came through at 10:13 a.m. sharp, subject lines screaming in all caps like a toddler demanding applause. Mandatory attendance. Business casual. Kale would be presenting exciting updates from the modernization effort. I didn't RSVP. I just showed up and sat in the back with a mug of burnt coffee and the expression of a woman who's watched too many men get promoted for surviving their own messes. Kale opened with a slide deck full of buzzwords and mismatched icons, bragging about streamlined document workflows and risk-informed audit gating. I nearly choked on my coffee when he said they'd revolutionized endpoint compliance by implementing a ticket escalation tree. I wrote that tree 4 years ago. Aimed the branches after trees, pine for production, birch for backups. No one noticed, or if they did, they sure as hell didn't mention it now. Then Chase took the mic. I swear the room temperature dropped 5 degrees. He launched into a speech about building on the strong foundation left by the old guard, which I guess meant me, though I'd apparently died somewhere between PowerPoint transitions. He smiled, smooth and dead-eyed, as he talked about decreasing audit lag time by 40% and centralizing compliance ownership under a leaner vertical. Every metric he cited, my work, my systems, my late nights untangling vendor spreadsheets with naming conventions that looked like catwalk model codes. Not a single acknowledgement. I clapped politely. 2 slow claps, hands like stones. By lunch, people were buzzing. Sandwich trays were picked clean, and Kale was posing next to a pull-up banner like he was about to headline a TEDx in Boise. Chase was surrounded by department heads nodding like dashboard bobbleheads. And then came the ping. From client ops. Subject, urgent client data anomaly. Turns out, one of our biggest enterprise clients had flagged an issue. Their SFTP logs showed files being modified by an unknown credential set, not exfiltrated yet, but touched. Timestamps misaligned. Audit trails incomplete. They weren't furious yet, just asking questions. The kind that feel polite until you realize they've already looped in their security lead, their procurement head, and someone with general counsel in their signature. Kale tried to downplay it, called it data drift, said it was non-impactful behavior from deprecated systems. Chase went one better, told the client outright that it was a residual hiccup from legacy integrations, promised the upcoming audit would be clean. That's when the dread kicked in, because I knew those systems, and I knew they weren't deprecated, they were still active, still tied to internal credentials that hadn't been cycled because Kale streamlined our offboarding policy into a Google form no one checked. I said nothing at the summit. I packed my things at 4:57, walked to my desk, and opened Outlook. One new message. 2. Compliance at CompanyCom. CC, legal at CompanyCom, audit liaison at Client CorpCom subject. Data trail review body. Please ensure all terms outlined in the current MSA are honored, including the compliance audit authorization clause. Jessica Morgan. I didn't attach anything. Didn't bold, underline, or explain. Just that single sentence. And I sat back in my chair and listened to the silence start to buzz. Because I knew someone was going to read it. I knew someone was going to open that MSA. And when they did, when they reached Appendix C, Bullet 7, they would see it. Final sign-off for security compliance and audit certification must be performed and approved solely by the head of compliance, Jessica Morgan. Not Kale, not Chase. Me. I closed my laptop, took the long way to the parking garage, and for the first time in months, I felt something just under my ribs, not revenge, not relief. Slow burn of inevitability. The satisfaction of a match resting just an inch above the fuse. They'd wanted my systems. They just forgot who built the locks. The email subject line didn't bother with pleasantries. Emergency SOC2 audit initiated 48-hour window. It landed in inboxes like a hammer through drywall. Apparently the client's legal team had escalated the data mishap up the food chain, and now the third-party auditors were coming in early. No wiggle room, no delays. They wanted logs, controls, access management records, vendor assessments, evidence of incident response, all of it. By noon, Kale looked like someone had taken a cheese grater to his confidence. He called a war room meeting. I wasn't invited, naturally, but I showed up anyway. Not because I needed to be there, but because it was time. The conference room was full of people who had no business pretending they knew what SOC2 even stood for. Chase sat at the head of the table with a glossy binder labeled compliance packet in front of him. His version. A collection of screen grabs, some flow charts, and one of those asinine infographics with stick figures pointing at padlocks. The lead auditor, a woman named Dana with iron gray hair and a voice like cold gravel, opened with a simple request. We'll need all compliance logs for the last 12 months, escalation documentation, and verification of sign-off authority on the last audit certification. Kale leaned forward. We've centralized everything under Chase's purview, so any approvals you need, Chase can provide. Dana blinked just once. Then, wordlessly, she pulled out a hard copy of the current MSA. The room went still. She flipped to Appendix C. Her finger slid down the page. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she read aloud. Final sign-off for security compliance and audit certification must be performed and approved solely by the head of compliance, Jessica Morgan, or an expressly designated successor in writing. She looked up. Is there documentation of that designation? Chase's face went slack. You could hear his jaw click as he tried to chew the silence into a response. I oversee all of that now, he said, forcing a smile that looked more like a spasm. The structure changed. We flattened the org. The consultant, Kale, he's the functional lead. Jessica isn't involved. Dana didn't nod, didn't blink. Just placed the MSA down flat on the table like it was a holy text. I see, she said. But this is the legally binding contract your company executed with the client 3 months ago. The terms are active. The clause is clear. She turned to me. Miss Morgan, have you approved the most recent security compliance package for this audit? I took my time before answering. I wasn't milking it, I was just enjoying the silence. You rarely get a moment where your absence rings louder than your voice. I looked around the room. Chase, Kale, the legal rep, the CTO in the corner pretending not to smirk. Then I spoke. No, I haven't been asked to review it, or have I been given access to the updated documentation? Kale made a strangled sound like a squirrel choking on a granola bar. Chase snapped. We changed the structure. Dana raised a single hand. Not in anger, just in precision. I'm not interested in internal restructurings. I'm interested in compliance as defined by your own contractual language. She tapped the clause again. And according to this, the audit cannot proceed without Miss Morgan's sign-off. Anything submitted without it is invalid. If a breach occurred while the signatory was unauthorized, your client may reserve the right to terminate for cause. That's when the room finally froze. You could feel it, not panic, not yet, something worse. The recognition that control had just shifted and no one had seen it happen. Chase looked at me finally, really looked at me, not as the woman who used to stay late and fix his mistakes, not as the legacy asset Kale dismissed, but as the person holding the kill switched to everything he thought he'd inherited. Jessica, he said, his voice strained, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We're on the same team. I smiled then. Gently, are we? Dana closed the MSA. We'll pause the audit until appropriate authority can be confirmed. We'll return in 24 hours. Meeting adjourned. I gathered my notes, took one last sip of cold coffee, and walked out before Chase could stumble into another sentence he didn't understand. They'd written me off. I'd just written them out, and the ink was already dry. The next morning, the glass walls around the executive conference room fogged with tension thicker than the stale coffee air. From my desk, still tucked conveniently outside visibility, I could hear the muffled scurry of admin assistants scrambling like someone had hit the corporate fire alarm. Chase had summoned the CEO back from whatever lake house or golf course he'd retired to early. That alone told me panic had finally reached the top shelf. Dana, the lead auditor, returned precisely at 9 a.m. with the posture of a woman who never misplaced a comma in her life. She carried the MSA in a leather folder, not a laptop, because when you wield truth like a blade, you don't need tabs open to prove it. I waited until I saw the last of the senior leadership shuffle into the room. Chase, Kale, legal, and now CEO Emeritus himself, Gregory Shaw, silver-templed and pissed. I walked in without knocking. No one stopped me. Dana acknowledged me with a nod. The CEO didn't. Chase opened his mouth but realized too late that anything he said would only deepen the trench he was already in. Dana began without ceremony. For the record, she said, sliding the document across the table, we are here to address Clause 14.3, as it relates to audit authorization. This was raised due to a discrepancy between stated organizational authority and contractual terms with your client. She read the clause again, slowly, precisely. Final sign-off for security compliance and audit certification must be performed and approved solely by the head of compliance, Jessica Morgan, or an expressly designated successor in writing. Then silence. The CEO finally looked up. Why is this the first I'm hearing of this clause? I stepped forward and placed a thin red folder on the table. Not thick, just 20 pages. That's all it took. A printout of every email where Chase had removed me from critical threads. A timeline of changes to internal compliance policies Kale had made without legal sign-off. Screenshots of Slack messages where Chase shrugged off breach flags with emojis. One reply simply said, LOL, we'll patch it later. I didn't say a word, just let the CEO flip through it. Chase cleared his throat. I think this clause is outdated. It doesn't reflect the current reporting structure. We've, realigned compliance under a flattened model. Legacy designations like Jessica's are no longer. Dana cut him off with the sharpness of a judge's gavel. This version was accepted digitally by your legal team 3 months ago. Timestamped. Confirmed by your general counsel's digital signature. There's no ambiguity here. Legal's rep, the same one who had nodded along during Kale's presentation last week, suddenly looked very interested in the carpet pattern. Chase's ears turned red. Sure, but that's not how we're actually running things. I mean, we've evolved. This whole thing is about trust and flexibility. Trust, Dana repeated flatly, is why we audit. Then she turned to the CEO. Mr. Shaw, your client has a termination for cause clause tied to non-compliant audit sign-off. If Ms. Morgan did not review or authorize any recent materials, as stated here, then your deliverables are non-binding. We will be issuing a temporary suspension notice to the client until this is resolved. Gregory Shaw leaned back. The leather of his chair creaked like it was groaning for mercy. He looked at Chase. Really looked at him. Not with disappointment, not even confusion, just a cold, dawning realization. You removed her? I didn't remove her, I just restructured some of the oversight and Kale coughed. Bad move. The CEO snapped. You stay out of this. Dana slid the folder back across the table. The client has already asked for confirmation that Miss Morgan is still employed and authorized. If she isn't, we'll likely face breach escalation. The stakes didn't need explaining. A termination for cause meant no severance on a multi-million-dollar contract. It meant reputational damage, possible litigation, and a ripple through every client holding a similar MSA. I looked around the room. Legal pale, Kale pretending to check his smartwatch. Chase, now visibly sweating through his pressed white collar. And Gregory Shaw, hands folded, eyes locked on me. You still have access to the full audit stack? He asked. I nodded. He didn't thank me. He just nodded back because this wasn't gratitude. This was survival, and everyone in that room had just realized whose oxygen mask they'd ripped off at cruising altitude. Mine, but I'd packed a spare. Labeled, time-stamped, airtight. What did you do? The CEO's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the kind of quiet that made every molecule in the room stop moving. Gregory Shaw stared at his son like he was trying to identify a smudge on glass, something vaguely familiar but utterly disappointing. Chase blinked, licked his lips, and opened his mouth like a trout flopping on a riverbank. Jessica, she rewrote the MSA language without approval. She embedded that clause without flagging it to leadership. That's not protocol. That's subversive. It's a compliance issue because of her. The table didn't react. No gasps, no outrage. Just stillness, the kind that says, wrong move. Dana, the lead auditor, didn't even lift her eyes. She calmly tapped her pen against the MSA. If by rewrote you mean documented the authority your legal team accepted and your client signed off on, then yes, Miss Morgan did that. She weaponized it. Chase's voice cracked. She knew we'd shifted to a new structure, and she laid a trap. She laid a protocol, said Dan, the CTO, from the far end of the table. All heads turned. Dan didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. But when he spoke, people listened because Dan didn't waste words. She laid the protocol I asked for, years ago after our second audit scramble. Jessica saved this company's ass more times than you can count, Chase. You cut her out. And this is what it looks like when your safety net walks away. Chase opened his mouth again, but before he could try another deflection, another voice jumped in. Seconded, said Michelle from legal. Every clause she inserted was in accordance with our compliance framework. We signed off. She did her job. We didn't do ours. Chase flinched. Michelle, she ignored him. And then, like a final nail clicking into place, came the voice of Jackson, the VP of Sales, Mr. Martini Lunch himself. Just got off a call with 3 enterprise clients. They're all requesting written confirmation that Jessica's authority is still intact. If she's not the one signing off, they're pulling deliverables into legal review. That's millions in play, Chase. Right now, the weight of the room shifted. No one was looking at me anymore. They were looking at him, and he was crumbling, his collar damp, his forehead shiny. His legacy shredded, not by a scandal, not by sabotage, but by paperwork. By precision, by the very systems he deemed too slow and too rigid. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just reached into my bag and pulled out one more folder. No drama, no speech. Just a slim, tabbed collection labeled, Client Assurance Template MSA Clause 14.3 Prepared Statement. I slid it onto the table. The CEO looked at it like it was a life raft drifting by in a storm. If you want to calm the clients, I said, you'll need to send that by end of day. Then I turned, walked out. No curtain call, no round of applause. Just the soft click of the door behind me. Outside, the bullpen was quieter than usual. A few heads lifted as I passed, not with surprise, not with pity, with recognition. People forget that power doesn't always come in shouting matches or grand slams. Sometimes it comes in a clause, sometimes it comes in silence, and sometimes it walks out of a room without looking back because it doesn't need to. Inside, I knew the hierarchy had shifted. They'd seen my face. Now they were showing theirs. The email hit at 8:07 a.m. Subject line, Organizational Realignment Announcement. Short, surgical. The kind of internal memo that tries real hard to sound like it wasn't typed through gritted teeth. Effective immediately, Chase Shaw will be transitioning into a strategic advisory role, focusing on long-term vision initiatives. We thank him for his contributions to the company's modernization efforts. There was no congratulations, no photo, no quote, just a polite exile wrapped in corporate gauze. The second paragraph was shorter. We are pleased to announce that Jessica Morgan has been offered the role of Chief Risk Officer, reporting directly to the CEO. Her tenure, leadership, and commitment to operational integrity are the foundation of this company's resilience and client trust. I sat with that sentence for a moment, not because I needed to read it again, because I wanted to remember how it felt, to be seen finally in print, not as a backup, not as a footnote, but as the structure itself. 15 minutes later, Gregory Shaw was standing in my doorway, no Chase in tow, no assistant, just the man himself, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, as if dressing down could soften what came next. I assume you saw the statement, he said, voice low. I nodded. I did. You've earned this. You've always been meticulous, loyal. Raised an eyebrow. You almost said stubborn. He smiled faintly. I meant it with respect. We sat in silence for a moment before he added, the board's on board, salary bump, executive tier, full authority over compliance, risk, and audit integrity. You'll report only to me. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my drawer and pulled out a thin envelope. Not dramatic, just prepared. I slid it across to him. He opened it, scanned the single sheet, and froze. It read, in lieu of a salary adjustment, I am requesting 5% equity in deferred Class B shares, vesting immediately upon appointment. Voting rights optional. This represents the value of systems retained due solely to my original authorship, implementation, and sustained defense against executive negligence. His eyes stayed on the paper longer than necessary. When he looked up, I met him squarely. No titles, I said, not unless they're real. Been the chief risk officer for years. You're just now admitting it. He nodded, not quickly, but deeply. Done. I stood and offered my hand. He took it, no platitudes, no speeches. Just a contract between two people who now knew exactly what the other was capable of. At 4:59 p.m., I logged into the internal dashboard, navigated to the cap table access portal, and refreshed the view. My name was there, Class B, 5%, not just a footnote. A stake outside Chase's old office was dark, empty except for a lone fern drooping under the weight of neglect. Inside mine, the light was steady. I leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and took a long breath, not triumphant, just finished. Everything I'd built, the logs, the clauses, the silence, had held. Sometimes power isn't given, it's written, buried in the fine print. And when the time comes, you don't ask for it, you claim it. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.